You're listening to What's Contemporary Now, a show about culture and the people, places, and things that together make it up.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
Suzanne Koller, much like an emblem, is a name that carries with it a certain degree of quality, meaning, and definitely an association with style. Knowing at the tender age of 13 that she wanted to work in art direction and graphic design, the Austrian-born and Paris-based image maker has without question made an indelible mark on the fashion industry. With her work as a co-founder of both Petronio Associates and Self-Service magazine, the Monde fashion director shares her perspective on a number of different things in this episode and reminds us to not only treasure the past or cherish the present, but to also trust our instincts for the future.
This is Suzanne Koller, and we're talking about what's contemporary now.
Suzanne Koller, one of the many things that's fun about doing this show is the fact that so many of the people we get the chance to speak to aren't typically out in front of the work, and they're somewhat elusive, such as yourself. So we're very excited not only for that reason, but also having you back because you were a contributor in the first chapter of What's Contemporary. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Going back to Vienna, before you even moved to Geneva for school, or obviously jumped over to Paris where you still live today, what was the early life of Suzanne Koller like?
Early life of Suzanne Koller was born in Vienna, growing up in Vienna. I moved to Germany and then Switzerland, where I actually started studying.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I was not all the time in Vienna. I feel very Austrian, but it's only a little part of my life.
Isn't it funny how that works? Even if it's a short period of time, it's formative years that sort of stay with us.
It has to stay with us. Now I live in France since over 30 years. And yeah, it has to stay with us somehow. So you feel more grounded, I would say, especially when you lived in several countries. If they're a little bit similar in a way, but...
That's the magic of Europe, right?
Exactly. But I think that's what it's important. So you stay grounded when you're still in your heart where you come from. I would say so.
And having grown up there and obviously moved to Germany before Switzerland, you had decided to pursue studies in graphic design first. What led to that choice?
When I was 13, I knew I wanted to become art director, graphic designer. That was what I envisioned my future.
Was there a particular moment?
Yeah, I would say like around 13 years old when they ask you what you want to be. And I don't know why I was especially drawn to that. It looked exciting to me back then.
Graphic design has become more important with each passing day, just in terms of how it contextualizes everything that we consume in our daily life.
Yes.
Creates the identity of things. So having studied, knowing that you wanted to be an art director, arriving in Paris, how did that then span into fashion specifically, or was that always a part of the goal along the way?
No, I didn't know at all actually that there was such a thing like working in fashion or being stylist or anything. So I came to Paris because I wanted to work for a magazine back then. It was Glamour, which was like a cool magazine back then. In early 90s, it was like run by Robin Derrick. Actually, I started being an intern at Elle magazine. And then I got an internship at Glamour, where I was graphic designer, intern in the beginning. And that's where I started seeing that actually you can do something in fashion also. But I was still graphic design. There was no idea to go any further in fashion at that point.
Did you ever struggle with the notion that you had to choose one particular box, or do you feel like you were always given freedom?
No, I never struggled because Ezra Petronio was my partner back then. And at that point, we decided to do our own company, graphic design, art direction. And then we started the magazine Self-Service. And even Self-Service was more like a magazine with like envelope, music, fashion, art. And it became naturally because it was more and more drawn to fashion. And as the magazine was more accepted by the fashion community, I would say, then naturally I could choose whatever I want to do because it was my magazine.
Of course.
So it was like a kind of natural move into fashion. But I was even doing much more graphic design and art direction. And only little by little, I started working on fashion stories. I never assisted anybody, which now I wish I could have done, but I didn't.
Why do you wish today that you would have? You've clearly done well.
I mean, when you learn just from scratch without really knowing the rules, it's a more difficult path, I would say. But I learned little by little in my own magazine. Back then, as you said, I didn't have to choose any way because I could do whatever I wanted. It was art direction, graphic design, packaging, whatever. I could do everything, and it was exciting to do all that together at that point.
Of course. That's an absolute luxury.
It is. And it's quite exciting also.
I wouldn't call it a common trajectory, that's for sure. And having had your hands in all of these things, you've even gone so far as to collaborate with APC on a few collections. And knowing that you have that background as a consultant, as a stylist, as an art director, do you feel like all of those skill sets culminate in any one project you're working on, or do you just switch hats along the way?
Both. I switch hats along the way, and also sometimes I like to focus on one thing more than another. I get easily bored also, so I like to switch actually. And I think it's also more interesting to see everything like in a global, even if I'm just hired as a stylist. I like the idea that you see everything as a global thing, and you know from where it starts and where it goes, even if you're not all the time part of, but the understanding of it is really interesting.
The holistic kind of grab it all.
Yes, could say so, yes.
And we're obsessed with new, which isn't a surprise given the sort of way our brains are physiologically wired, where novelty triggers things like dopamine and such. But speaking of having started a magazine, you've also actually been working on an exciting, fun project with your daughter, no?
Yeah, we're doing fanzines together because I find it a little bit more difficult sometimes to work for bigger magazines today because there's so many restraints. So I like the idea to do fanzines, whatever you want to do, and no restrictions, which is difficult when you have like a carte blanche, but it is somehow also exciting to switch from something more commercial to something where you have a total freedom. And it came up that my daughter, because she likes photography, to work with a new generation. I find it quite exciting to see like a new perspective on your work, on your expertise, on my expertise.
Of course. But you said something that I'm always fascinated by, which is that it's difficult when you're given carte blanche, right?
Oh, it's the most difficult thing.
But let's talk about it. Why is that? People always think that creative freedom is the goal, and yet when you're given absolute freedom, it's the most challenging thing. So can we expand on that a little bit?
It's because maybe we're not artists, because we're working within a commercial restraint. And somehow it's easier when someone gives you like a quote or something where you have to think about like a hint on something and you have to develop that. When you just have a carte blanche, is even more difficult. And I don't know, I really prefer somehow when you have someone who gives you like a direction and you have to resolve that problem. And somehow it's once you have too much money, it's always never the best idea. It's actually better when you don't have so much money for a project. Then you have to really search for ideas and come up with something, and you get almost better in what you're doing.
It's amazing. It makes so much sense. And obviously it's something that we see time and time again with different success stories, or the development and growth of a particular brand that might sometimes over time lose that edge, maybe for the reasons you're describing. But something I learned about recently, and I'm not entirely sure if they do it in Europe as well, I would assume so, but DMR, is that like a system for magazines? Are you familiar with that?
No, not at all. What is that? Or maybe it's in French, so you say it differently. I don't know.
Yeah, apparently it's this system that all of the LVMH and Kering brands, as well as some other brands, apply to publishing, whereby they attribute a certain number of points depending on the number of full looks versus mixed pieces.
Yes, no, I'm familiar with that when I was working at Vogue. Totally, yes.
Yeah, so apparently at the end, you get less points if you mix brands, but if you do more full looks, you get more points. And then those points accumulate into the amount that informs the budget that's given to your magazine on the next issue. Is that true?
Totally. Yeah, that's true. And also how big the model is in the picture or not, how many points you get for that, yeah.
Wow.
Which obviously restrains your creativity as a stylist or photographer.
That's why I thought about it, was because you were talking about the sort of creative benefits of having restraints, right? You have something to push against, and you definitely do in commercial publishing, that's for sure.
Yeah, that's what you have to do. And it's a good training. Work with clients, then you're well trained in a way, but it restrains definitely your creativity at one point when you do too much of that. So it's good to do like personal projects or independent magazines, but even they fall now more or less in that category, right?
Of course. And in addition to the fanzine projects that you're working on with your daughter, do you have other personal work outlets that you play with as a way of keeping things balanced from the commercial projects?
And once again, I like to jump from commercial publication or fanzine or independent magazine, or I like the idea that you can do various things to keep your brain active somehow.
Absolutely. Again, it's novelty, right? Diversity of projects. Those are things that keep things in flow states and fresh.
Definitely, yes, because I think, especially me, I'm getting easily bored when I do always the same thing over and over again. So I think that's how you easily get challenged. And I think that's the most important thing in our work, to get challenged when you're creative.
I agree.
Yeah, it's actually, I don't know how much you're challenged when you have a carte blanche. You need probably this kind of freedom from certain moments, but it's good to come back and forth, I think.
And that brings me to my perception of your work and the common thread that we can call to mind when someone says your name or you're associated with a particular project, which is the paradoxical intersection of timeless and the new, right? And I think that what's really interesting about your work is that there's something that never feels so specific that it would be relegated to a particular time. There's a timeless quality, but do you feel like there are common threads in your work, or do you not necessarily analyze it that much?
I don't think I analyze it that much. It's less about the fashion, it's more about the woman. And I like to document women. I think I see myself as an image maker more than a stylist, because that was also the reason when I actually switched from art direction to styling, because I did realize when I was art directing that you have less complicity with the photographer. And I had the feeling as a stylist, I have much more complicity and I'm more hands-on by the image making. I have the feeling when you create an image for this, it becomes timeless because you don't concentrate on the fashion anymore. I want to see the woman in the image. And so I have that feeling that maybe that's what makes it an image timeless.
So it's really a different driver, essentially, in terms of what goes into the way you approach image making. It's not necessarily placating the bits and pieces as much as, like you said earlier, the holistic approach of the whole image. Who is she?
Yeah, and it's really about the woman. I mean, I really now see it more as documenting. I mean, I do appreciate working with models. I've worked 10 years ago and work now again with them because it's documenting women through the time. It's also the whole setup, the team together. For me, a model is part of the team. It's not just an object you dress. It's part of the team. I know I ask her opinion if she feels great or not. She's really part of the team, the hair and makeup, the photographer. So I think maybe that's what you can feel also in the images, that it's a real teamwork and it's not just like projecting an image on a woman.
It's a little bit of a jump, but to this day, it's still one of my favorite issues of the first iteration of What's Contemporary that you had done for us. And in response to that question, you had curated 4 different categories that you labeled as be obsessed, know your classics, treat yourself, and be inspired. Have any of those things changed?
Do you remember what it was?
Yeah, they were just such beautifully curated selections, and they were very specific, and something as nuanced as the cute little mouse that your son gave you that you carried in your purse, to a pair of white Chanel jeans, to Hermes patterns. I think it was maybe wallpaper. It was just a really beautifully curated illustration of your thoughts on what was contemporary in that particular moment. And so I was curious, again, going back to the idea that certain things are timeless. In those categories for you, have any of those things changed today?
I think my obsessions are always the same, but I have the feeling it's like an ongoing thing in my life. Being obsessed, it can be about food, about fashion, or like a particular item or furniture. I think that's just probably evolving because that's like a while ago, but it's like a important part of my life. The obsessions in general can be anything. I can be obsessed about anything. It probably just pulls out things you really love and you feel confident about. I would say that's obsessions with ongoing. You can be always a new obsession in my life because I love that.
We're meaning-making machines, right? As a species, that's a part of our DNA just in terms of how we move through the world. And when things seem meaningless, it's quite bleak. Having sustained such an incredible career as a creative through these years, what is it that you continue sourcing inspiration or attributing meaning to today that sort of drives those things or prevents you from getting bored?
I think it's always the obsession about, searching for new creative talents, I would say. Finding like kind of new generation of people working with I mean, that drives me definitely, I would say. It keeps me creative and inspired.
That's always a conversation that we're keen on having, which is understanding the differences in generations. And obviously, having worked with so many of the greats throughout the span of your career in terms of legendary photographers, but also liking to work with new talent. Do you see any difference in the approach given that they've come up in different times? Or do you feel like it's just different approaches to a similar space?
It's different approaches in the sense because it's new for them. So they're fresh. It's also the kind of urge because today a career of a photographer can grow quite quickly, but it can also disappear quite quickly. So, I mean, the amount of work a photographer has to accomplish today is 10 times more than 10, 20 years ago. So the young generation, they go much faster than we did probably. But it's tricky for them, I think, because they have to go very fast and they're praised very fast. And it's probably more difficult for them to explore different fields than before. A fashion photographer can explore much more in different fields because there would be less. People easier jump from one photographer to another talent because they don't really have the time to explore so much more. But I find it just interesting and inspiring to work with new talents because their approach is just new in a way because they know less. They're less blasé also about certain things. So in that sense, I find that quite inspiring. And it's always a challenge to work with someone new, I find, and bring the best out of that person somehow. When I want to work with a photographer, it's because I like their work and I try to bring the best out of them. I don't try to impose anything on them, go with them to do the best we can together.
And how does it differ when you're working with people you've collaborated with for years, like Glenn Lutchford, who we love? Obviously, that's a very different process. What's that one like?
It's also a great challenge, but if you know each other more, you have a better complicity somehow, and you go into a shoot with more ease, let's put it that way, than with a new photographer, young photographer, especially they all work also now on film. So you don't really know what you're going to get. Glenn, our photographers on that level, it's a pleasure. And I mean, it's also interesting because to push yourself to do something interesting, and that's part of our job, right? Because we always come up with something new and different nobody has seen before. It's more you have this complicity and this more comfort. You're more in your comfort zone. But I think it's also interesting that sometimes you are out of your comfort zone because sometimes I do believe by accident or by surprises, you can do also something very interesting you haven't expected before.
It sounds exhausting, this notion that we have to continuously reinvent the wheel.
It's totally exhausting, but that's what pushes me further in a way, because I think that's what the great part of our job, that we constantly have to push ourselves and think about something else different from a different angle, because that always pushes you forward. But that's part of an artistic job, somehow to push yourself always. I think once you're too much in your comfort zone, you get bored, and I think your work becomes boring.
So outside of working with new talent, how is it that you go about keeping yourself outside of your comfort zone?
Most of the time, discovering new talents, being curious. And I would say in my work, because I'm a workaholic, so all I do is working and creating images. So I would say that's really the way how I put myself out of my comfort zone.
Do you have those returning themes in your life that you often go back to for inspiration?
Yes and no, I don't know. Not really, not that much. I think I would go further. I would go back as maybe to the 90s. But then I have the feeling we have done that also so much. I do the past and I do what I accomplished or what I lived, but I rather go more into new things which surprises me somehow. I don't feel necessarily very comfortable going too much back. Let's put it that way. Or I'm less inspired by that.
Well, that's another thing that's incredibly interesting in terms of the zeitgeist and it being a moving window. And again, the formative years that we all come up in and sustaining a level of awareness of what's going on in the world and pop culture and in different creative industries in a way that continuously informs your process and gives you those new ideas. I feel like a lot of people just assume it's like museums and reading good books and keeping up with cinema. But what are your tricks?
My tricks is really daily life. Yeah, of course, all these things you just mentioned are inspiring, but I would say I try to empty my brain, which is very difficult, but you need to empty your brain, do a reset from time to time, which I do when I run or when I travel, but even while I'm traveling, when you take the plane, I empty my brain. And honestly, I'm like a sponge, and for me, everything is inspiring. When I'm somewhere in the middle of Italy going to a supermarket or restaurant, having great food, everything is inspiring to me. It's not just going to a museum. It's whatever you see in everyday life. Definitely not being always in Paris is part of that, because otherwise you go crazy. I realized that when we were in confinement, that really drove me crazy, because when you're a sponge and you have no more ways of getting new information, I find it difficult to get inspired. Yeah, I would really say it's like encounters with people. What I think the difficult part for a lot of creative people sometimes when they isolate too much, I think you need to go out and have an everyday normal life to get inspired and get a feeling of watching people, getting a feeling of how the world evolves outside social media or something.
I love it.
For me, that's the most inspiring somehow. Can be really anything.
On one hand, the first impression or the first thing that came to mind when you started with that answer was the very real consideration that other aspects of our life can actually make our work life better, rather than the more you work, the better it gets. Something balanced about the different things that you explore, to your point of a market in Italy or the real world and the magic in the mundane. But by the end of it, it almost touches upon the idea that there's sort of something to be said about analog or things that happen in offline spaces. You mentioned social media not being the only source of inspiration. Do you find yourself taking distance?
Yes, definitely. I try to have a distance or put my phone down when I travel or I'm in a car or things like that, because otherwise I don't think it's a source of inspiration anymore. It's a source of information maybe, but not all the information either, because you see over and over the same things somehow on social media. I really try as much as I can, because obviously we're all addicted to it, but
Of course. And that touches upon our last and final question, which we of course have to ask you. What is contemporary now?
it's a tricky question, you know that.
Yeah.
I would say, especially in our times where everything is changing so fast. And honestly, personally, I don't know where we're going and what's next, because that's always the question people ask. For me, it's keep things simple, stay true to yourself, treasure the past, live in the present, which is very difficult to achieve, and trust your instincts for the future. That's my kind of mantra for the moment, because everything is so complicated and changes so fast, and in some ways we're also going backwards. So I would say that's, for me, my contemporary.
Well said. Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of What's Contemporary Now. A special thanks to our show's producer, Cheyenne Asadi, who makes it all possible. Audio post-production by Griffin James, with original theme music by Joseph Top Miller and Chase Coughlin of the Black Soft, and visual design by Aaron Meager and Graham Prentice. Subscribe now to be the first to catch new episodes every week, and if you've enjoyed listening, we'd love to hear from you. Leave us a review and let us know your thoughts. Your feedback helps us improve and reach more listeners like you. Follow us on Instagram, Threads, and LinkedIn for additional content, and join the conversation around what is contemporary now.